The night my husband stood up at our son's wedding reception and announced he was starting a new chapter, with his hand resting on another woman's shoulder, the entire ballroom went silent. 200 guests turned to look at me, family, friends, people I had known for 30 years. And my husband, Gerald Whitmore, smiled as if he had just delivered the best news of the evening. What he didn't expect was that I had already read every word of the speech he was about to give. I had found it, printed and folded, in the breast pocket of the blazer he'd left hanging in our closet 3 days earlier. And I had spent those 3 days preparing an answer. But before I tell you how next, I need to tell you how we got there. Because the ending of a marriage doesn't begin the night everything falls apart. It begins years earlier, in the small, quiet moments you convince yourself don't mean anything. My name is Constance Whitmore. I'm 63 years old. And for 37 years, I believed I was one of the lucky ones. Gerald and I met in the fall of 1987 at a community college in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was 26. Finishing a degree in accounting, I'd started late after a few years working as a bank teller. He was 28. Studying business administration, the first person in his family to pursue anything beyond a high school diploma. He used to joke that he was the longest-running student in his family's history, and even then, the joke made me love him a little. We were friends, first. That part matters because I think I spent 30 years holding on to the memory of that friendship, long after it had been replaced by something colder. We married 3 years later in a small ceremony outside Raleigh. My dress cost less than $200. The flowers were from a grocery store. My mother made the cake. I didn't care about any of that. I was marrying my best friend. And nothing about the day felt small to me. The early years were genuinely hard. Gerald had gotten a position at a regional property management company, but the pay was modest and the hours were long. I was working full-time as a bookkeeper for a small construction firm, and within 2 years we had our son, Patrick. 3 years after that, our daughter, June. There were months when I moved monies between accounts just to make sure the electric bill cleared before the mortgage. Months when I skipped lunch because the grocery budget had already been stretched past its limit, and I didn't want Gerald to know. He was already carrying enough. What people don't tell you about those years is how close they can make you feel to someone. When you're struggling together, you stop keeping score, you just keep moving. I was the one who suggested Gerald start his own company. That surprises people when I tell them, because in later years Gerald told the story differently. By the time he was being profiled in regional business publications, the origin story had been polished into something where he was always the visionary. Always the one who saw the opportunity. But I remember the exact evening. We were sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, and Gerald was going through job listings because he'd been passed over for a promotion again. He looked defeated in a way I hadn't seen before. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "You've been building someone else's dream for 6 years," I said. "What would it look like to build your own?" He stared at me for a long moment, then he said, "I'd need a lot of help." I told him he already had it. What followed was a decision that frightened me more than I ever admitted. To help Gerald launch Whitmore Property Solutions, I left my bookkeeping job and took the company on as my full-time work, without pay, for the first 2 years. I handled every financial record, every vendor payment, every tax filing, every loan application. When the company needed a line of credit to take on its first major contract, I used the inheritance my grandmother had left me as collateral. Every dollar, $34,000 that I had been holding on to like something sacred. My mother thought I was out of my mind. Maybe she wasn't wrong. But Gerald held my hand that night and said something I carried inside me for decades. He said, "I will never forget what you're doing for me." Never, I believed him. The company grew. Then it grew again. Gerald turned out to be exactly as talented as I always believed he was. Within 10 years, Whitmore Property Solutions was managing commercial developments across 3 states. We moved from the small house in Raleigh into a beautiful home outside Chapel Hill. The children had stabilities, opportunities, space to become themselves. I watched my husband become successful and felt proud the way you feel proud of something you helped build with your own hands. Because I had, Patrick grew into a careful, steady man who went into finance. June became a physical therapist with her mother's stubbornness and her father's charm. Watching both of them become adults was the best thing I ever witnessed. And then, somewhere in the middle of all of it, Gerald changed. It happened the way most slow disasters happen. Gradually, then suddenly. The first thing I noticed was the traveling. Gerald had always traveled for work, but there had been a rhythm to it, predictable stretches with predictable returns. Sometime around his 58th birthday, the rhythm changed. Trips became more frequent and less explained. Site visit became an answer for almost anything. When I asked for details, the conversation shifted before I got them. Then came the phone. For 35 years, Gerald and I had shared everything without question. His phone sat on the kitchen counter the way mine did. If it rang and he wasn't in the room, I answered it. If mine rang and I was in the shower, he picked it up. There were no secrets built into the ordinary architecture of our lives, until there were. One afternoon I picked up his phone to hand it to him, and it asked for a passcode. I stood there holding it for a moment, not quite believing what I was looking at. He walked in from the garage and saw my expression. "Company policy," he said immediately. Too immediately. "New security protocol." The explanation was reasonable. That was the problem with Gerald's explanations during that period. They were always just reasonable enough to make me feel foolish for doubting them. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Not snooping, just watching. And what I saw was a man who was slowly redirecting himself away from me. Gerald began running in the mornings, which he had never done. New clothes appeared without mention. He lost weight, cut his hair differently, started paying attention to things he used to ignore. One evening, I commented on a new shirt, and he said it was for a presentation, and then the week after that, there was another new shirt, and another. There was an evening when I was telling him about a conversation I'd had with June, and I realized partway through that he hadn't heard a word. He was looking at his phone beneath the table, smiling at something on his screen. The kind of private smile that doesn't belong to a marriage. "Gerald," I said. "Nothing." "Gerald." He looked up with the expression of someone interrupted from something more interesting than the person in front of them. I didn't say anything else that night. But something settled in me that I couldn't undo. A quiet, terrible knowing. The confirmation came in ceases. A hotel receipt I found tucked inside an old folder when I was organizing the home office. 2 guests, a suite, a resort in Savannah that Gerald had told me he wasn't visiting that month. A photograph on the company's social media page, from an event Gerald said he attended, where I couldn't find him in any of the images. A name that began appearing in his email threads, copied on communications that had nothing to do with her stated role. Her name was Renata Sloan. I'd never heard Gerald mention her. According to the company directory, she had joined Whitmore Property Solutions about 14 months earlier, hired as a client relations director. But the more I looked at her involvement, the meetings she was included in, the access she'd been given, the way senior staff seemed frustrated by her influence, the less her role looked like any ordinary hire. There was one email from a longtime operations manager that stopped me cold. He had written to Gerald asking why Renata was being included in financial strategy discussions when she had no background in finance or operations. Gerald's response was 3 words. "Because I trust her." I read those 3 words 4 times. I didn't confront Gerald. That will confuse some people. But I had spent enough years doing careful work to know that confrontation without information is just noise. I wanted facts. I wanted to understand the full picture before I made a single move. I called a friend who had been through a difficult divorce several years earlier and asked for the name of her attorney. 2 days later, I was sitting across from a woman named Rebecca Lawson in a downtown Raleigh office. Rebecca was composed, experienced, and within the first 20 minutes of our conversation, she asked me something nobody else had thought to ask. "How involved were you in building the business?" I told her everything. She leaned forward when I got to the part about the inheritance I had used as collateral. She leaned further when I described the bookkeeping work, the loan applications, the 2 years of unpaid labor, the documents I had signed alongside Gerald in the company's early years. "Do you still have copies of any of this?" she asked. I told her I had kept everything. She looked at me for a moment. "Good," she said. "Because I think your husband may have forgotten more than he realizes." That evening, I went through every filing cabinet and storage box in the house. I had always been the one who kept records. Gerald had always been the one who looked forward. Between us, decades of paperwork had accumulated in folders that he likely hadn't thought about in years. By midnight, I had discovered something that gave me an unexpected steadiness. My name was still attached to the foundation of that company in ways Gerald had long since stopped considering. Financial guarantees. Collateral agreements. Original loan documentation. My signature, present in the earliest and most consequential papers, at a time when my involvement had made the difference between the company surviving and failing. I wasn't simply a wife. I had been a cornerstone. Rebecca brought in a financial specialist named Henry Okafor, a forensic accountant with a background in business dispute cases. Henry was methodical and thorough, and within a few weeks of reviewing available records, he had flagged something that changed the shape of everything. Several financial transfers within the company showed patterns that were inconsistent with previous years. Consulting payments that seemed inflated. Account movements that happened more frequently than the business model warranted. He wasn't ready to draw conclusions, but he was asking questions that Gerald would eventually have to answer. I asked Henry if he thought Gerald knew what he was looking at. Henry paused before answering. "I think he may be more focused on the immediate future than on who's paying attention." Around the same time, I had lunch with a woman named Cecilia Hammond, one of the company's original investors, and one of the few people from those early years who had always treated me as a full participant in the business rather than a secondary character in Gerald's story. Cecilia was careful with her words, but she wasn't vague. "Something's happening with Renata Sloan," she said, not looking up from her coffee. "And I don't think it's only what Gerald thinks it is." I asked her what she meant. She described unusual patterns she'd observed at executive meetings. Renata asking questions that went well beyond her role. Renata pushing for access to documentation that even senior staff didn't routinely see. A persistent, quiet aggression beneath the polished surface that Cecilia said had put more than a few people on edge. "She's not just interested in Gerald," Cecilia said. "She's interested in the company." The thought had been forming in my mind for weeks. I hadn't wanted to give it too much room because it seemed almost too calculated to believe. But the more Henry found, and the more Cecilia described, the more a specific possibility took shape. Renata Sloan had come into Gerald's life as an employee. She had become his affair partner, and she had used that position to gain access to levels of information and influence that no 14-month employee had any legitimate reason to possess. Whether she was acting alone or on behalf of someone else was a question Henry was still working to answer. But one thing had already become clear. Gerald had trusted her with far more than his heart. The irony of that was almost unbearable. The man who had spent years treating me as though I couldn't possibly understand the business was handing confidential strategy, financial projections, and company relationships to a woman who had been inside the organization for barely a year. All of this was still unresolved when Patrick called to finalize details for his wedding reception. Patrick had married a quiet, steady woman named Charlotte the previous spring, in a small ceremony in Vermont. The reception in Raleigh had been postponed until the fall, and now it was 6 weeks away. During our call, Patrick mentioned offhandedly that his father had asked to say a few words during the evening. I thought nothing of it at the time. 2 weeks before the reception, I found the speech. Gerald had left his blazer on the back of our bedroom chair. I was moving it to hang it properly when a folded paper fell from the breast pocket. I picked it up. I don't know exactly what I expected. I wasn't looking for anything. I started reading. By the second paragraph, my hands had gone cold. It wasn't a toast to Patrick and Charlotte. It was a speech about Gerald, about transitions and new chapters, and the courage it takes to pursue authentic happiness. It referenced, without naming her, someone who had helped him see his life more clearly. It thanked his family for their understanding. It was written for an audience. It was meant to be a public declaration dressed as a wedding toast. He was planning to use our son's wedding reception to announce the end of our marriage and the beginning of something with Renata Sloan. I stood in the bedroom for a long time after I finished reading, not crying, just still. Then I called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring. I read her the speech. There was a brief silence. When is the reception? 2 weeks. Another pause. Then she said, carefully, I want you to think about something. I told her I was already thinking about it. The next morning I went to her office. We sat together for 2 hours. Rebecca had already prepared documentation based on Henry's findings. Not accusations, not speculation, but a clear and careful summary of financial patterns that raised serious questions about how company assets had been managed in the previous 18 months. Henry joined us by phone. By the time we finished, I knew exactly what I was going to do and exactly how I was going to do it. Rebecca handed me a sealed envelope before I left. Divorce papers. I put them in my evening bag. The night of the reception, I dressed carefully. I chose a dark green gown that June had helped me pick out. Simple and elegant, the kind that doesn't announce itself but doesn't disappear either. I stood in front of the mirror before we left and thought about the woman I had been when Gerald and I arrived at our son's wedding in Vermont the previous spring. That woman had still been hoping she was wrong about everything. The woman in the mirror now knew better. Gerald was in a good mood on the drive over. Relaxed, almost chatty, the way someone is when they believe they've already won something. He complimented my dress. He talked about a business opportunity he was watching. He said it was going to be a wonderful evening. I smiled and looked out the window and thought, yes. In a way he doesn't understand yet, it will be. The reception was beautiful. Charlotte's family had helped transform the venue into something warm and luminous, soft lights strung above round tables, late-season flowers in terracotta pots, a small band playing near the back. Patrick looked happier than I had seen him in years. Charlotte was radiant. For a few hours, I held on to that, the realness of their joy, and I felt it alongside everything else I was carrying. Renata Sloane arrived at 7:30. I had expected her. I had thought about what it would feel like to see her in person in a room full of people I loved. I had prepared myself for the possibility that the reality would hit harder than I anticipated. What I hadn't fully prepared for was how at ease she looked. Not nervous, not careful, at ease. She wore a champagne-colored dress and moved through the room with the particular confidence of someone who has already decided she belongs somewhere. She greeted executives from Gerald's company by name. She paused to talk with 2 investors who had attended our company holiday dinners for 15 years. I watched Gerald notice her from across the room. I watched his expression shift in a way it hadn't shifted in my direction in a very long time. Cecilia Hammond was standing near me. She touched my arm lightly. You okay? Yes, I said, and I meant it. Around 8:15, the band paused, and Patrick took the microphone to thank everyone for coming. His voice was warm, a little nervous the way his voice always gets when he's speaking to a crowd. He thanked Charlotte's family and his own. He looked at me while he was saying it, and his eyes stayed on my face for just a moment longer than they might have otherwise. He knew something was different about the evening. He just didn't know what. Then Gerald stood. Patrick handed him the microphone with an ease that made my chest tighten because Patrick trusted his father completely. That trust was one of the things Gerald was about to damage beyond repair, and he didn't seem to understand it yet. Gerald cleared his throat. He thanked Charlotte's family. He talked about the joy of watching his son build a meaningful life. He talked about legacy and love and what it means to commit to another person. The room listened warmly, nodding, smiling. Then his voice shifted. Tonight also feels like a moment to honor honesty, he said. The kind of courage it takes to live truthfully, even when it's difficult. The room's warmth cooled, almost imperceptibly. People who knew us felt it before they understood it. You could see it in the way they glanced at each other. There are changes coming in my life, Gerald continued. Changes I believe will ultimately be better for everyone, including the people I love most. I stood up. The movement was quiet, deliberate. People noticed because I wanted them to. I walked towards the small platform where Gerald stood, and with each step the room became a little more silent. Gerald watched me approach with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not confusion, something closer to the particular look a person has when they realize the game they've been playing has shifted underneath them without warning. I stepped up onto the platform beside him. Gerald, My voice was even, it carried. He lowered the microphone slightly. Constance, this isn't. I reached into my evening bag. The room was absolutely still. I took out the sealed envelope and placed it in his hand. He looked down at it. He looked at me. Then, slowly, he opened it. I will not forget the way the color left his face. The confidence that had defined him all evening, that had defined him for years, disappeared in the time it takes to read a single page. His hands tightened on the papers, then loosened, as though he wasn't sure whether to hold them or let them fall. He said, my name again. Quieter. I took the microphone gently from his other hand. I looked out at the room, at Patrick, who had gone very still at his table, Charlotte's hand in both of his, at June, who was standing near the back with tears already forming, not from surprise but from grief of a thing she had long suspected finally becoming real, at Cecilia Hammond, who gave me the smallest possible nod. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My husband prepared a speech tonight about new chapters, I said. I thought it was only fair to bring one of my own. The silence was total. Those papers are divorce documents. I didn't look at Gerald when I said it. I looked at the people who had known us, who had watched our family grow, who deserved the truth. 37 years ago, I helped build a company from nothing. I signed my name to loans. I used my grandmother's inheritance to keep us afloat. I handled the books, the filings, the payroll, every record that existed in those early years. I did it because I believed in my husband and in the life we were building together. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp. More like an exhale. What I've learned recently is that the company I helped build has some financial questions that will need to be answered. My attorney is here this evening. Rebecca Lawson had been near the entrance for the previous 20 minutes. At that moment she stepped forward, visible to the room, composed and unhurried. Gerald's eyes went to her immediately. The papers in his hand seemed heavier now. Across the room, several of the company executives were already speaking quietly to each other. Two investors I recognized had stopped smiling entirely. Cecilia Hammond stood with her arms folded and her eyes fixed on Gerald with an expression that said she had been waiting for this accounting for some time. Renata Sloane stood very still near a side table. The ease was gone. In its place was something I recognized as the expression of a person calculating their next move and finding the options limited. Gerald stepped toward me. Constance, please. His voice was low, meant only for me. Did you plan your announcement privately? I asked, my voice still level. He had no answer. You chose this room, I said. You chose this night. I simply chose to be honest about what that night actually means. Patrick left his chair and crossed the room to me. He stood beside me on the platform without saying a word. That single gesture told me everything about who my son was. A moment later, June made her way through the crowd and stood on my other side. Gerald looked at his children standing with their mother, and I watched something in him go quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet in years. Not strategy, not calculation, just a man seeing very plainly the cost of his choices. The reception did not end dramatically. It ended the way most rooms end when something true has been spoken inside them. People lingered, spoke in low voices, found reasons to say their goodbyes. Several long-standing company partners came to find me before they left. Not to say much, just to say they were sorry and that they had respected me for a long time, and that they were paying attention to what Rebecca would be presenting in the weeks ahead. Renata left without speaking to anyone. The legal process that followed was long and often exhausting. Rebecca and Henry had prepared carefully, and the documentation of my role in the company's foundations proved exactly as significant as Rebecca had believed it would be. Gerald's attorneys were skilled, but they were working against 37 years of paperwork that I had preserved, and Gerald had forgotten existed. The settlement took 7 months. When it concluded, I had received what I had helped earn. Not more than that, exactly that. 3 months later, I moved into a smaller house on the eastern edge of Raleigh, close enough to June that she can stop by without planning it in advance. Patrick calls on Sundays. Charlotte has become, quietly and without ceremony, one of the people I trust most in my life. June helped me unpack the kitchen the first weekend. We were wrapping dishes in newspaper when she stopped and looked at me. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner, she said. I knew something was wrong for a long time. I know, I told her. I should have. You were in an impossible position, I said. And you were here the night it mattered, she cried a little then. I let her, because some grief needs to move through rather than past. Patrick took longer. He was angry at his father in a way that became quieter and more complicated as the months passed. He called me one evening about 5 months after the reception and said simply, I keep thinking about what it must have cost you to stay calm that night. I told him it hadn't felt like staying calm. It had felt like finally being exactly who I was. As for what I discovered about Renata Sloan, Henry's investigation eventually produced documentation suggesting connections between her and a competing firm that had been pursuing several of the same contracts as Whitmore Property Solutions. Whether Gerald ever understood the full shape of what had happened to him, I don't know, but I believe he was handed the worst kind of lesson, that the person who made him feel seen was watching something other than him. I don't take satisfaction in that. It's simply true. Gerald called me once, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized. He asked if we could talk. I met him at a coffee shop near the university neutral ground familiar enough to make the conversation possible. He looked older. He looked like a man who had spent several months with himself and found the experience difficult. He said he was sorry. Not once, not quickly. He sat with it the way people sit with something they've earned, that he hadn't shown since we were young, and I could hear in his voice that he had been going back through those years trying to find where he had stopped seeing clearly. I listened. When he finished, I told him something I had decided before I arrived. You were a good husband for a long time, I said. I don't think it's useful to pretend otherwise. But what you chose to do in the last few years, the lies, the plan for that night, what you were willing to put Patrick and June through, I can't carry that and stay well. He nodded. I don't hate you, I said, but I'm not able to forgive something I'm still standing in the middle of. He accepted that. It seemed to cost him something to accept it, which was honest. We didn't speak again after that, not with hostility, simply because there wasn't more to say. I've thought about what I would tell a woman standing where I was standing 18 months ago. Before I found the speech in the blazer pocket, before I understood how far the betrayal had extended, before I knew what I was capable of, I would tell her this. Your name on a document matters. The work you did matters. The records you kept matter. The sacrifices you made that no one else saw matter. And when the moment comes to stand up in a room full of people and tell the truth, even when your hands are shaking and you have no idea how the story ends, you will find that you are steadier than you thought, that all the years of being quiet and careful and reliable built something inside you that the person who underestimated you never saw coming. I'm 63 years old and I live in a house I chose for myself, in a city I know, near the people who chose to stand beside me when it counted. On Sunday mornings, I drink coffee on the back porch and watch the light come through the trees. And I feel something I haven't felt in a very long time. Not rescue, not victory. Just my own life, finally, completely mine.